What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some of my favorite game mechanics, as I was recently, like a fair few people I would imagine, playing through some of the Reign of the Warlock content that was just added into Diablo 2 25 years after the fact. And I was spending some of that time messing around with, of course, the Runewords, one of the more iconic mechanics of that entire game, but obviously that got me thinking about the concept of game mechanics in general and innovation, especially these days, which may well be a video topic for another time. Because today, of course, what I want to talk about is these mechanics, and we might as well just jump right in there at the start with Diablo 2, of course. So, the Runewords of Diablo 2, I think, are just really fun for me personally to play around with for a variety of reasons. But more than anything, I think they in particular scratch an itch that these types of systems usually get for me. So you're actually going to see that come up a bit more in this video alone, but I do find systems that take individual elements and then allow you to mix and match them together to form unique things, from a very zoomed out perspective anyway, to be more engaging than that simple description would imply. And I think the reason for this is that they are often used in ways that allows the individual pieces to feel like arcane or esoteric in some way, which is perfectly captured by these Runewords. And the crazy thing is, to me at least, Diablo 2 is, I would say, pretty well known for this type of progression at this point, but it didn't actually launch with these. Something that people tend to forget is that the expansion Lord of Destruction is what brought Runewords to Diablo 2. So some of its iconic mechanics and the way the game works weren't even in there when the game launched, which I always thought was funny, especially all these years later now that they're adding even more stuff to it. But one of the reasons I really loved this mechanic was, as a kid, kind of just learning and figuring out some of this stuff for myself. I've mentioned here and there that, I didn't have a great childhood and I had an unhealthy relationship with video games, and Diablo 2 was definitely at the center of some of that. But one of the things that really kept me engaged is learning, again, just all this weird intricacies of how that game worked, especially at the time when it was brand new to me. So I remember learning about Runewords just period, and then I remember getting to level 97 with my Wind Druid and debating about which armor piece to wear. So these days, I believe Enigma is still considered best in slot for most people, but I think there's a case to be made for Chains of Honor, as it provides more readily available defensive options, but everyone loves Enigma because it gives you the teleport. But likely, before you get something like those at all, you'll more than likely, in the endgame at least, start with a runeword like Smoke, because it's incredibly easy to make and gives you a bunch of resistances, which you're going to need in order to survive on Hell mode to begin with, to start farming up the runes you're going to need for those bigger rune words, provided you can't trade for them, etc., etc., etc. And I got into all of those little micro discussions after finding out that these little weird things I had been finding everywhere could be slotted into socketed equipment in just the correct way in order to make something new and interesting. And I remember the very first one I made, probably like a lot of people honestly, being steel. Steel is an incredibly easy runeword to make, and you may well make it by accident if you didn't know what you were doing, because all it requires is that you put Tur and L in that order into a weapon with 2 sockets. And not only are those the first runes you're going to find, you can easily find weapons with 2 sockets on the initial difficulty by Act 2. And that's important because some of the better rune words, the ones that require 5 and 6 sockets to actually make, you can't even get those until the later ones, not only because of the runes it requires to do so, but because the items with the right number of sockets just straight up won't drop. But all of that just to say that, I discovered these runes and then got into the depths of how to min-max them and how to make them work for me, and it was just a really great time, and I remember it to this day, and I think it's at least in part why I enjoy some of the other systems we're going to talk about here, like I mentioned. But what a fun one for me, at the very least. Second up, I want to talk about I always call it the Gambit system, but tactics or AI systems, but in a very particular way. So what I'm referring to specifically is the Gambit system from Final Fantasy XII, which was essentially a series of if-then statements that allow you to set up your party to react to certain, of course, conditions and everything, and what you want them to do to automate what they're doing in combat. And that is also a system that I just had a ton of fun with. But Final Fantasy XII is not the only game to do that, and while it did come out before Dragon Age Origins, this is one people who've played Origins will be familiar with because it has a tactic system that works in a very similar way. But truth be told, my absolute favorite iteration of this system comes from Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire. Functionally speaking, it's not that much different, just a series of conditional if-then statements, but it is really all the extra stuff that is added to it in Deadfire that makes it more enjoyable in my opinion. Like the ability to set like a cooldown on a specific set of instructions as an example, or the fact that you can just kind of set it based on what you know and even save presets and stuff that you don't have to set up every time. And you compare that to something like Final Fantasy XII where you have to like straight up go buy some of the conditionals before you can even start using them, and Pillars 2 just has a much easier access to one of the core features than the other two, because even Origins you have to unlock like the extra tactic slots and stuff. So for me at least, there's always been this really fun aspect of mitigating all of that, especially because it kind of felt like an evolution of the way that stuff worked in older CRPGs, which I had played. So stuff like Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, etc., they have like scripts and stuff you could set up for your companions for the real time with pause mode. However, they were incredibly basic by comparison, and so you have systems like the Gambits, tactics, and the just AI setup in Deadfire in general, and it felt like it really took those things and properly expanded upon them in a way that felt like a real step up, and it's always been a system I've really enjoyed, though I am fully aware some people don't like it because they feel it automates things a bit too much for them. But that sounds like their problem, because we're moving on to number 3. Number 3 is actually the Mythic Paths from Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, my favorite game in fact. But what really sold me on Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous at first was the Mythic Paths period. And to this day, while I think Owlcat is doing a lot of really interesting stuff, I think Rogue Trader's really come into its own via its DLC and stuff. I think the upcoming Dark Heresy and its investigation systems are really interesting and unique. By far and away, my favorite thing that Owlcat has done is not only Wrath of the Righteous, but specifically this Mythic Path system, because I think it leans so far into the specific fantasy of being one of these beings that you can turn yourself into via this system, like an angel or a demon by default, or, potentially even a devil or an Azada, a trickster, etc. And the way that each of those is then also accompanied not only with incredibly, let's say, detailed mechanics that allow you to do all sorts of crazy stuff build-wise, but also like their own story that you can follow throughout the game is one of many reasons that my story supercut for that game is like 5 hours long. It's a system that I think just really captures the idea of, like being a lich and leading this army against these demons, etc. And while the Mythic Path system does exist in the tabletop version, I don't really want to get into all that because it's a bit different, but they took that system and then on top of the already very complicated comparatively to most other TTRPGs Pathfinder system, and you've got a situation where just the build diversity and the ability to build things that are just absolutely crazy and see all these different combinations is wild. And that's why I covered that game for years until they finally themselves stopped putting out content for it. But to my mind, the Mythic Path system, while I think it would be obviously very difficult to translate to any other game really, does such a fantastic job of both merging the sort of aesthetic fantasy of what those things are with the mechanical depth that is native to Pathfinder and taking that even farther, perhaps to the game's own detriment at times. All just makes for a really incredible system, and that's why I am so in love with that game all these years later, and that's before we even start talking about the rest of it. But we're going to keep it moving because next up we've got number 4, which is Spellcrafting, a bit ambiguously, but I will say that Tyranny is a game I love the Spellcrafting in the most. However, Spellcrafting systems as a whole tend to be really fun because, again, you take often different pieces of things, smush them together until you get something a bit more unique, and then, of course, learning how to apply all those things in different ways. And I know when people think spellcrafting, they often think Bethesda titles even, things like Morrowind, Oblivion, etc., that let you do exactly that, and yet Tyranny, Obsidian's other CRPG franchise that they can't do anything with anymore because they don't own the rights to it, had a spellcrafting system in it, and I thought it was just so well done because it let you, of course, pick and choose the usual stuff like the sort of base element and then the form of the magic, etc., but your characters also had a special lore stat, which basically decided how many of these spells and how strong they could be that you could then make and assign to them, and that allowed you to do all sorts of crazy stuff. And it was just like a really well-designed system that had limits because of the way it was made, but with things like the lore skill scaling up and allowing you to cast all these like insanely powerful spells if you get up to that point was just an incredibly fun time. And while you could obviously make similar cases for other games that use spellcrafting, Tyranny is always just the version of it that spoke to me the most. Though I will say just a random shout out to Outward 2 for having the most fun like casting actual magic as opposed to just setting up the effects and everything. But admittedly a slightly different case there. That does, however, bring us to our final entry, and this is none other than the Flaws system from The Outer Worlds 1 and 2. The Flaws system is another kind of thing that I think is interesting in the sense that I don't know how well it would fit into like basically any other game without some, at the very least, aesthetic reworks to some of it, not to mention obviously mechanics and things like that as a concept. But the Flaws system is one I was drawn to from its very first outing in the original game. It was one of their big selling points for it, obviously, but as many people have stated, the flaw system was quite flawed in the original game because what it comes down to is you could potentially take some negative in exchange for a perk point, but a lot of these were so weak that many times it was just a straight up free perk point. The Outer Worlds 2, which released relatively recently, I think just about 5 or so months back, took that system and really ran with it until it came into its own. I would say the revamped flaw system is easily my favorite part of The Outer Worlds 2, specifically for what it does for build diversity and allowing you to focus in on a particular play style or some weird thing you're doing. And it does that by encouraging you to continue to play that way for bonuses, and if you don't play that way after you take it, potentially some negatives. One of my favorite ones actually wound up being the one that allows you to, I say allows, but actually forces you to take every flaw that you encounter. Meaning that by the end, you've got a bunch of different flaws, all forcing you to do various things, which makes for a certainly unique playthrough, if nothing else. But a lot of them, I think, were designed in a way that often coincides with certain perks and things you can get otherwise outside of the flaw system, which all then kind of synergizes into just fun builds you can mess around with, and that's before you even start talking about like the backgrounds and stuff. So all of that to say, I do think it's a bit of a shame when we heard relatively recently that there might not be another Outer Worlds game, at the very least anytime soon, I would imagine. My mind immediately jumped to what do they have in mind for the flaw system, because I think it would be a shame to leave that in the dust entirely. But carrying it forward, again, requires you to answer questions about things like, how does that system fit into the game we are making, etc., etc. So time will tell if we ever wind up seeing that one again, but to be fair, you could say that for a few other mechanics on this list as well. But either way, that is where we are going to leave off this particular video. There's been just a handful of some of the more unique mechanics that I've really enjoyed over the years, though it's hardly an exhaustive list, and to that end, I would love to hear about some of your favorite mechanics down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.